Hey everybody, welcome back to Pride and Prejudice. Reading through this will cover chapters 11 through 15 of Volume 1. And, well, no spoilers. You'll see. So in chapter 11, Jane has become well enough to finally leave her sick room and join the others, and everybody is glad to see that she's better, especially Mr. Bingley. Mr. Hurst, who is the husband of Mr. Bingley's sister, wants to play cards, but apparently nobody else wants to, so he just takes a nap on one of the sofas. Mr. Darcy gets a book, and so does Miss Bingley, but she's really paying attention to Mr. Darcy and trying to pull him into conversation, but she's not successful. She finally asks Mr. Bingley if he's going to have a dance there at Netherfield, and he says he's definitely looking forward to it. I wonder why. Miss Bingley gets up and walks around the room, trying to get Mr. Darcy to notice her, quote, elegant figure. But he does not take the slightest notice. Because of, and I quote, the desperation of her feelings, she asks Elizabeth to get up and walk around the room with her. Supposedly because, again quoting, it is very refreshing after sitting so long in one attitude. Maybe I should try that with my students. Perhaps it would refresh them after a good hour or so of instruction and practice to, as they say, take a turn about the room. Anyway, we never get to find out whether or not Elizabeth finds it refreshing because our narrator demands our focus on Mr. Fitzwilliam freaking Darcy, who apparently looks up as soon as Elizabeth so much as moves, and gasp, he even closes his book. But alas for Miss Bingley, he refuses to join them. So here's where it gets interesting, confusing, maybe a little of both. Anyway, Mr. Darcy says that he can only think of two reasons they would want to walk up and down the room together, and that in either case he would be in the way. But he doesn't tell them what those reasons are. And he says this when he refuses, offering that as his reason for refusing even before they can ask him to supply one. So it seems like Mr. Darcy is deliberately baiting them, which means he's socially adept enough to do that, which further means that he was aware that he was being a jerk to Elizabeth back when he saw her. He knew what he was doing, knew it was a rotten thing to do, and did it anyway because he was okay with being unkind and hurtful. I'm not going to be letting go of this anytime soon, folks. So then, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy go back and forth a bit with a few subtle digs at each other. He implies that she'll make fun of anything. She implies that he is vain and proud. Miss Bingley asks Elizabeth of the result of her, quote, examination of Mr. Darcy, and Elizabeth says, and while the author does not tell us so, I imagine that it is completely straight-faced, I am perfectly convinced that Mr. Darcy has no defect. And yet, one might suspect that she is not being completely forthright. Imagine that. Mr. Darcy responds to Elizabeth's quip as though she is serious and offers his own thoughts on what his primary faults are. He's picky, noticing all sorts of faults and, quote, follies and vices of others, and he holds grudges. In another well-known line of dialogue, he declares, my good opinion once lost is lost forever. But Elizabeth hasn't been being serious, and so she doesn't respond in a serious manner, because the obviously appropriate response is, if Mr. Darcy realizes that this is a flaw in his character, what's he doing about it? Unfortunately, she doesn't realize that he is being serious, and so she just quips back at him. He says that everyone has some, quote, natural defect that can't be fixed. Again, totally missed opportunity for Elizabeth to shoot back, well, have you even tried? Nah. Austen just has her make this way over-the-top accusation that he just tends to hate everybody. Because apparently that's the kind of person that she is. I don't know. Does not seem consistent to me. However, that way he is able to respond somewhat more reasonably that she chooses to misunderstand people on purpose. This is unfortunate because it keeps Elizabeth from retorting that at least choosing to misunderstand people prevents her from being disappointed by their true character. But I don't think Austen would allow her to be even that barbed. Anyhow, the chapter ends with our narrator informing us that Mr. Darcy, quote, began to feel the danger of paying Elizabeth too much attention. Ooh, whatever. Chapter 12. Elizabeth is so ready to get out of there. The chapter opens with the narrator telling us, in consequence of an agreement between the two sisters, Elizabeth writes and asks to have the carriage sent over that day so that they can go home. However, let us not forget which sister is gentle and sweet and conceding, and which sister is, less so. However, Mrs. Bennet wants them to stay at least the rest of the week, and says that if they get invited to stay past that, it's quite fine. But Elizabeth is like, forget that nonsense, and she gets Jane to ask to borrow Mr. Bingley's carriage, and I quote again, immediately. She is so ready to leave, and for goodness sake, I do not blame her at all. Ugh. But then the Bingleys are like, oh really? No, don't go, at least stay until tomorrow, pretty please. And Jane gives in to them. See, Elizabeth, you should have gone and asked yourself. I know you were thinking that Mr. Bingley's affection for Jane would get you what you wanted, but what you should have done was go and tell him that she was well enough to travel and that she would have a complete recovery more quickly at home with her family around her, you know. But unfortunately, they're stuck there for another day and nobody's actually happy about it. And Mr. Darcy is very careful not to interact with Elizabeth at all. So, and then Sunday after church, they finally get to leave. And everybody is actually happy about that. So why there was even the whole rigmarole about them not leaving Saturday, I don't know, except maybe to show that everybody was being polite, even when it made all of them miserable. Anyway, Mama is not pleased that they have come home, quote, so soon, but their father is glad to see them. The narrator tells us that, quote, the evening conversation when they were all assembled had lost much of its animation and almost all of its sense by the absence of Jane and Elizabeth. And see, I don't really get that. First of all, Jane has not been presented as a particularly animated sort, even if she's not quite so reserved around family as she is around company. And second, why is it that the younger sisters are the silly ones? Is it just the effect of their age? Don't they have the example of their older sisters at least? I guess we're just supposed to take it that Jane and Elizabeth are more naturally intelligent because they would have had even less guidance than their younger sisters have had. The narrator gets in a few more digs at poor, plain, awkward, pedantic Mary, and then Catherine and Lydia have some gossip about the militia boys, and that's the end of chapter 12. Chapter 13 starts with Mr. Bennet picking on his wife. Ugh. TLDR, his cousin, probably not his first cousin, Mr. Collins, the heir, will be coming to visit. Mrs. Bennet is not happy about this. Also, there's a short mention that Mr. Collins' dad and Mr. Bennet didn't get along, but it doesn't really explain why. Anyway, Mr. Collins sends a letter to ask if it's okay if he comes to visit. It's somewhat highly mannered and a little self-congratulatory, but in my opinion, it comes across as tentative and uncertain, which is understandable, given that the families haven't been on good terms. Plus, due to the entail, he's the one that gets the house they all live in when Mr. Bennet dies. Mr. Bennet says that he hopes Mr. Collins is the opposite of sensible, and I'm not sure why. Mrs. Bennet calms down after hearing the letter, and that surprises pretty much everybody. When Mr. Collins shows up, he is very complimentary. Unfortunately, he attempts to compliment the ladies' cooking, and this ruffles Mrs. Bennet's feathers because they have servants for that sort of thing. He apologizes profusely, and she calms down, but we are told he keeps apologizing for the next half hour. Chapter 14. Okay, so my pre-reading impression has been that Mr. Collins is kind of a toady for Lady Catherine, who is his patron. Mr. Bennet has just asked him about her, so let's see if he is as bad as I've been led to believe. Lady Catherine has a daughter who will inherit. I don't remember hearing about her. Anyway, Mr. Collins says that she is sickly, but at the same time, she drives by his house pretty regularly. So, it's difficult to know what to make of that. Miss de Bourgh has not been presented because of her indifferent state of health. Mr. Collins says that he enjoys thinking up ways to say things that flatter Lady Catherine and please her, but without it seeming clumsy or obvious. Mr. Bennet thinks he's absurd and finds it entertaining, perhaps humorous, to listen to him. Mr. Bennet then invites Mr. Collins to read aloud to the girls, and Mr. Collins agrees, but turns down a novel, saying he never reads them. As an English teacher, this is amusing. Novels at the time were for entertainment rather than improvement. So it's kind of like someone agreeing to go out to the movies, but then turning up their nose at, say, Birds of Prey and the Fantabulous Emancipation of One Harley Quinn, saying that they only watch films with artistic merit. Instead, he chooses a book of sermons that the, I'm sure, well-intentioned Mr. Fordyce wrote for the benefit of young ladies. He reads, quote, with very monotonous solemnity. And Lydia, who was shocked when he turned down the novel and is apparently bored out of her skull, actually just butts in to tell her mother something about their uncle. Jane and Elizabeth tell her to shut up, but Mr. Collins is already offended and gives a lecture about young ladies not appreciating what is good for them and says he won't bother her any longer. I imagine this with a rather long-suffering sigh. And then he offers to play backgammon with Mr. Bennet. They have a lot of games that I'm not familiar with. Chapter 15. This chapter opens with the narrator giving us some direct expository description of Mr. Bennet, who is, quote, not a sensible man. I think this might actually mean that he doesn't perceive things intensely or feel deeply, because I remember some discussion about the title Sense and Sensibility, which to modern ears sounds redundant, but that's because the meaning of the word sensible has changed in the intervening years. Its prior meaning can still be found in archaic phrases like to fall insensible, as in losing one's senses. And in that book, the elder sister, who is very pragmatic and keeps a tight rein on her emotion, is sense, and the younger sister, who is much more open and free with her feelings, is sensibility. However, in the previous chapter, Mr. Bennet's opinion of Mr. Collins as something of a dolt is presented as though Mr. Bennet is accurate in his estimation. So it could be either. Or maybe both. I don't know. Anyway, Mr. Collins intends to marry one of Mr. Bennet's daughters as a way to keep the property more immediately in the family, since Longbourn is entailed and he will inherit. He first looks at sweet, gentle, good, graceful, darn near perfect Jane, but Mrs. Bennet steers him away from her by mentioning that she might be engaged soon. However, as I'm still in Volume 1, I don't think it will be that soon. There are probably going to be some complications that come up to prevent it. Everyone knows you can't have a wedding in the first part of the book. Anyway, after breakfast, Mr. Collins goes with Mr. Bennet to the library, but Mr. Bennet doesn't like that because he goes there for peace and quiet, and Mr. Collins won't shut up about his house and garden. So he invites Mr. Collins to go on a walk with the girls in order to get rid of him. Mr. Collins prattles on during the walk to town, and the girls politely say stuff like, "Oh, really?" and "Imagine that," until they get to Meryton. They see one of the officers known to Kitty and Lydia, Mr. Denny, who introduces all of them to Mr. Wickham, who is charming and handsome and looks like a perfect gentleman, whatever that means. He's also just accepted to pose as an officer, which of course just makes the girls like him even more. So, okay, spoilers. Just skip ahead about 30 seconds if you don't want them, because I'm going to divulge something. Spoiler space, spoiler space. Okay, here it is. I already know the thing about Mr. Wickham. I know he is a bad sort. I know about the whole Lydia thing. I think it's Lydia anyway. I still get her mixed up with Kitty. Anyway, how they run off together and he doesn't marry her and he has no intention of doing so. And it's going to ruin not just her, but the entire family. But Mr. Darcy goes up and gets Mr. Wickham to marry her, and that at least saves the family's reputation, although Lydia is stuck with a husband who is apparently a bad sort. Anyway. Okay, so hopefully you can come back now and everything is okay. The spoiler bit is done, so we can go back to the rest of it. I'm back into chapter 15 now. So as the group is chit-chatting, Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley come riding down the street. Mr. Bingley, of course, heads straight for Jane. Mr. Darcy is trying to avoid looking at Elizabeth, and in looking everywhere else, he notices Mr. Wickham, and their eyes meet, and it is very significant. We are told that one turns white and the other red, but not which one does which. Interesting authorial choice, that. And Elizabeth sees all of this happen, and is quite curious. Anyway, Mr. Bingley is completely oblivious, probably because Jane's there, and after a little more conversation, he heads on and Mr. Darcy leaves with him. So the remaining group goes to Mr. Phillips' house. He's the uncle, remember, and the officers leave while the family goes in. There's some chit-chat, and Jane introduces Mr. Collins, who is extra super polite, which makes a lovely impression on Mrs. Phillips. The girls want to know more about Mr. Wickham. Mrs. Phillips doesn't know much about him, but she promises to get her husband to visit Mr. Wickham and invite him to join the other officers who are coming over for dinner the next day, and asks the family from Longbourn to come by as well. So it seems like that branch of the family gets along well, though there's not much detail. Mr. Collins is extra super polite again, but it doesn't really seem to bother anybody except the narrator. When they get back to the house, Mr. Collins sings the praises of Mrs. Phillips, which endears him to Mrs. Bennet even further. I'm not sure how the Phillipses and Bennets are related, but based on Mrs. Bennet's reaction, I would guess that Mrs. Phillips is her sister. Anyway, Mr. Collins is very glad to have been invited for dinner the next day, even though he'd just been introduced. He says he figures it's because he's part of the family. Quote, but yet he had never met with so much attention in the whole course of his life. Aw, I like Mr. Collins, or at least I feel for him. Like, he's around Lady Catherine, and he kind of enjoys the mental puzzle of saying things that will find favor with her, and he enjoys earning her favor, but, like, she doesn't listen to him. And as his reading of the sermons was described as, quote, monotonous, his parishioners probably don't listen to him much either. I think Austen is too mean to him. He's awkward and insecure and a little conceited, but he doesn't seem like a bad person. Mr. Bennet needs to get over himself. And that is the end of chapter 15. So thanks if you've watched this far. I really appreciate it. And I hope if you have read the book, you will tell me your thoughts down in the comments. Or if you haven't, what your expectations are, that sort of thing. It's always welcome. I love getting feedback. I love seeing what you think. And I'm always looking for book recommendations and interesting reviews. You can find me on Goodreads. I have my profile link in the description below. Thanks again for watching and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye, everybody.